Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to this August session of the Canopy Collective. It's great to see people jumping on from different parts of Australia. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're based and the connections of those custodians to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other First Nations people joining us today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Josie Gibson, and I have the rewarding task of supporting the terrific team involved in growing the Canopy Collective, a unique national network of peers to support resilience practitioners in your work in coming years. And this is big work indeed. The formal program of which this is a part is just one part of this growing network around Australia. And we encourage practitioners and those with an interest in this space to connect with each other, to share insights and expertise, because your networks and networks of networks will prove a valuable source of intelligence and support in your work. So a little bit about what's coming up. After this, we have an afternoon check-in on Tuesday, August the 27th, where you'll hear from some of our Canopy communities on their progress with the 6-step model. And for those of you who have done the practitioner training, you'll be familiar with that. And then we have a morning session on Tuesday, September the 10th on storytelling, because we see that as an integral part of this work, telling a different story, a better story about what's possible. And we're going to feature engagement specialist Jax Nee Karte, who's joining us from Canberra. And one of the stories we're increasingly hearing is the critical role of connection and belonging in building stronger and more resilient communities. So hence our great pleasure in introducing today's guest speaker, Professor Daniel Aldrich. Strong social ties, that sense of connection and all that enables are a core part of Daniel's extensive research agenda, which revolves in part around post-disaster recovery of communities, but has far broader application for the health and sustainability of individuals and community well-being. Daniel's work has taken him right around the world, to locations including India, Japan and Africa for field work, to research the impacts of disasters and the rate and nature of recovery in these communities. So a really pioneering field in this arena. Daniel is Professor of Public Policy and Political Science, Director of the Resilience Studies Program and Co-Director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. He's also joining us today from Washington, DC, where he's teaching. So here's a man who gets around. As well as being the recipient of multiple Fulbright fellowships and Arbor Fellowship and numerous other fellowships and awards, Daniel has been published widely in the academic and mainstream media. He's a sought-after commentator, and he's authored 5 books, including Building Resilience and Black Wave, which captured his extensive work in post-tsunami Japan. And there is another one in the works, and if we have time, Daniel might have some talk a little bit about it, looking at the role of social infrastructure in solving wicked problems. Can't wait for that one.
With the intro.
So if I could ask you to mute your mics, thank you. Daniel has been a frequent visitor to Australia in recent years, and we're so delighted to get to know you and your work firsthand, Daniel. So he has a fair understanding of the big resilience challenges that communities in across Australia are facing, you know, in the context of the global challenges of climate change. And we're very grateful that he's made time to speak with us today. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Daniel. Step back. I will step back and in after your presentation and help sort of field and wrangle all the questions, and we'll get through what we can. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Josie. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I miss being in that amazing library there in Australia. That was an amazing visit there. So hi, all. I'm Daniel Aldrich. Nice to meet you. And I've put out my email address and also for the hellscape that is Twitter, or now X, if you want to join me on that place as it fails slowly. Happy to meet you there as well. So I'd like to begin talking a little bit about why I care about this concept of disasters. And I'd like to give the after and before pictures. So here's the before and after, I guess. This was 6944 Canal Boulevard. Looks great in New Orleans, Louisiana. And unfortunately, as you might have known, about 7 weeks later, we didn't have much time to settle in our new home with our new car. My very first job was there in New Orleans. And of course, Hurricane Katrina destroyed 80% of that city, flooding it with about 2.5 meters of water throughout. And I really began thinking about ourselves, our community, what would it mean to recover? What does resilience mean in that context? And because I had no job, Tulane never opened in 2005, I began to read a lot about what resilience means. How did academics write about it, economists, policymakers, and so forth. And I saw really an interesting spectrum. On one side of the spectrum was the idea of individualizing disaster preparedness and recovery. And this image in front of you now encourages you to get ready. So do you have insurance? Do you have a kit? Do you have food and water, a cell phone charger? Are you ready by yourself? Implying if you are ready, then somehow your recovery will go well, things will go well for you. At the other end of the spectrum, beyond the individual, though, of course, is the top-down state-centered approach. This is one of my favorite images from field work in Japan, up in Tohoku. That's a Japanese grandmother, an obasan, about 1.4 meters tall. And if you stack up the obasans on the screen in front of you, this is about 14 meters of seawall that's being built there for 200 kilometers. So a lot of the spaces along the coast in Japan protected by these kind of seawalls. And many people arguing, of course, that this will keep them safe. This is the government's argument as well. Between the individual, though, and the state, I would argue, in fact, the core element in both recovery, but also survival and thriving has nothing to do with individual choices and little to do with state, but rather the engine of recovery comes from our social networks, bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. And just by the way, if your mic is on, please do us a favor and just turn it off to make sure everyone can hear. Thank you. So bonding social capital, that is the connections that we have to people that are like us, family, friends, people who sound like you. If you're a fast-talking American living in Adelaide for 6 months, probably many of your friends will be fast-talking Americans living in Adelaide, as I did about a year ago for my sabbatical. Bridging social ties and contrast connect us to people who are different than us, different background, ethnicity, race, religion, ways of thinking. Bonding and bridging are horizontal ties. They connect us in similar levels of power, but linking ties are vertical. So I know the premier, I know the governor, I know the head of my institution, I know the dean. These ties matter. We can't just lump everything under social capital. We have to be very careful about what we're talking about because these different ties activate differently at different moments. I just want to give some theoretical reasons why we should care, and then give you some data from the work that we do as a lab on disasters and recovery. So the first choice made by any survivor after a major shock is whether or not to return to a damaged home, condominium, apartment, hut, to go back again, even though we've seen the areas vulnerable to shocks. This might be a tsunami, it might be the Black Fires, who knows? But after that event happens, everyone who lives there knows that the house as it was, the apartment as it was, is vulnerable to that shock. So going back involves all kinds of costs. Opportunity costs for not going someplace else. You can have a clean slate, begin again someplace less vulnerable. They involve financial costs. Oftentimes, if you did have insurance, there's a big gap to the actual costs of recovery, and psychological costs as well. If you lost a loved one, a friend is no longer there, your pets might be missing, you maybe lost all your clients from your business, very serious costs. So for a lot of survivors of disasters around the world who are able to move, they do. This is the voice versus exit problem. So what would get them to stay then? Why would they stay in an area hit by a major disaster? So what we found was a sense of place, strengthening ties between bonding and bridging, and the belief that this is where I belong. My favorite story comes from Japan, actually, where a 90-year-old grandmother told me that she was going back to Fukushima, even though it was heavily irradiated, because that's where her family cemetery was, that's where she had been raised, that's where she wanted to die as well. And she had no interest in hearing the warnings from those of us concerned about radiation. So exit and voice, the very first choice made by a survivor of a shock, highly affected by social capital. The next theoretical aspect I would call the collective action problem. Many of the challenges that we face after a major disaster can't be solved by one single family or one institution. They require us to work collectively. And if you've ever tried to get a club together or an entire organization together at once, good luck. Usually the president shows up, maybe the CEO or whatever, and maybe the 5 regulars, but a lot of other people don't show up. So to get that to work, we need people to know each other quite well. That's what social capital gives us. It gives us the chance to say, hey, I noticed you weren't at the meeting last night. What's going on? Are you okay? Or even to know that they're missing, right? To know that there was a person who's supposed to be there. So after a disaster, many of the challenges that we face require people working together. Imagine an area hit by a mudslide. Every house has to work together collectively to clean it up, to get the mud out of the streets, out of their homes, out of the parks, or else they'll still have areas that are dangerous. So collective action strongly influenced the social ties. And the third and final reason why these matter, what I would call informal insurance or mutual aid. Hopefully everyone in this audience right now has health insurance and life insurance and car insurance, all that kind of stuff. But you can't buy informal insurance with money. The only way to get this is by investing time and effort in relationships before a disaster starts. Can you imagine after a major typhoon, knocking on your neighbor's door you've never met and saying, "Hi, can I sleep in your basement the next 2 weeks as I get my house to be fixed?" It's probably not going to work. But if you built up relationships beforehand, they know who you are, you might be able to get that bedroom, right, for a few weeks as your own house is fixed up. So informal insurance is the third thing that comes with strong social ties. I want to talk now about specific information that we have from the work that we do as a lab. And by the way, all of these papers are here available for you on my website and elsewhere. You can look them up, no problem. The first is what happens before a disaster arrives? To what degree is social capital an important part of that? And I'll just give you one example of Hurricane Irma, which hit Miami, Florida, on the 8th of September, 2017, in the midst of what we call hurricane season. The red dots that you see around Miami, those are cell phone signals. We tracked everyone who several days beforehand was unfortunately right in the path of that hurricane. By the 6th of September, 2 days before it arrives, you see blue dots popping up on the screen. Those are good signs. People are leaving Miami. They've gone to other places like Boston or Connecticut or so forth. And by the 8th of September, there are many, many blue dots. It's a good sign. People are safe. They're out of harm's way. The bad news for us, though, of course, is that there are a lot of red dots. People didn't listen to the evacuation orders. So the obvious problem for authorities is before a disaster arrives, it's the easiest moment to save lives. Before the disaster arrives, get out of harm's way. There's a hurricane, a typhoon, a fire, move out of the area. So why aren't people leaving Miami beforehand? So I apologize for the size of this image, but I wanted to capture all elements. We had about 1 million people that we studied on Facebook, and we characterized their Facebook ties as bonding, bridging, or linking. So think about bonding ties as having the same last name or being an uncle or an aunt or a grandmother. Bridging ties would be people different than you, different ethnicities, races, backgrounds, and so forth. And of course, linking ties are vertical ties to authorities. If the core ties that you had during these hurricanes were to people like you, the bonding social capital, all those red dots mean you didn't leave your home. You were still there in Miami several days after authorities told you to leave, and that meant we had to rescue you if you were alive or find your body if you were dead. So these bonding social ties did not activate evacuation. In contrast, the bridging and linking ties, individuals who have broader, more diverse networks, those individuals did listen early, and they did leave the area, and they were safe and sound. They didn't cost us the time or money for rescue. They didn't have to get harmed by that hurricane. So we notice even before a disaster arrives, our social ties impact the way that it impacts with us. That's from North America. Let's go to Japan for a second. These images come from Japan's 3/11 triple disasters: earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdowns. This is from a town outside Rikuzen, Takada. They're up in the north in Tohoku. And that was a major tsunami. It was about 20 meters plus in some cases. It took around 19,800 lives or so along the coast. The good news, though, with that major disaster is most cities and towns along the coast didn't have any casualties. If you look at this chart, this histogram in front of you, that big bar, the vertical bar at 0, that's the percentage of towns that we're studying that had no casualties. It's a good sign. The bad news, though, is that there are some communities along the coast that had 1%, 5%, some as high as 10% of the community was killed by that tsunami. And the obvious question is, all of these towns got hit by the exact same shock. That same tsunami slammed aboard 100 plus towns in the area. Why did some communities have such high casualty rates and others have much lower ones? Many people that we talked to said, well, that's pretty obvious, right? It's the power of the wave. It's the power of the disaster. The bigger the earthquake, the bigger the tsunami, the bigger the fire, the more casualties. That's actually not true, as you can see here in this image. We've mapped out how tall the tsunami was on the x-axis and mortality on the y-axis. And you see a number of communities with very high tsunami, like Tanohata, with relatively low levels of mortality. Onagawa, Rikuzen, Takada, Otsuchi there in the center top, with moderate tsunami, very, very high levels of casualties. And on the left, Rifu, Natori, Yamamoto, again, very short tsunami, not even 6-7 meters, but very high casualty rates. So one of the benefits of being a knowing social scientist is you get to ask questions of people for a long time. So I spent about a year and a half in Japan after 2/11, asking people in Japanese, survivors, NGOs, mayors, and engineers, what had happened in their communities. Why did they think we had this variation? I think there are 5 categories of answers, more or less. The top left answer was from the engineers in the room, who argued it was really about concrete. How big was the physical infrastructure? How much protection was there from seawalls and berms and dikes? They argued, of course, the more protection, the safer you would be. Beneath that is a picture of Japan's diet, not what they eat, but their legislature, where people go to do their work as MPs. And of course, the argument here would be politics might make a difference. Communities that supported the long-ruling LDP, maybe they had better money, more money for disaster drills, and communities that supported the opposition parties, maybe they didn't get that money. It's cynical, so I like it. Bottom left-hand corner is the image of the wave itself. We dismissed this a few seconds ago. The middle image is of an obasan, again, a grandmother. Maybe demographics matters. Maybe some of these communities had older residents, and more of them than other communities. The final image, though, is going back to social capital. What if our social ties could somehow save our lives during a major disaster like this? And I heard in my interviews I did at 200 interviews along the coast, many, many stories like the following. People who were elderly and infirm knew there'd been an earthquake, but couldn't get out of bed in time to get from low ground near the ocean to high ground where it'd be safe. And the only reason they survived was because a neighbor, a friend, a caregiver knocked on their door, came in their house, and literally put them on their shoulders into a wheelchair. They put them into a bed, sometimes even on a bicycle, and got them to higher ground. That was over and over again. And in fact, the data that we have shows the best predictor of surviving this tsunami wasn't demographics. It wasn't all the things I just mentioned, political voting and infrastructure. It was the strength or weakness of bonding ties. In communities where we had stronger ties to the left of the axis, casualties were like 1 in 1,000. But as communities had less cohesion, less interaction, less trust, and less likelihood of saving each other's lives, then we have roughly 1 in 50 people dying. So in fact, we did a pretty good modeling job here finding this was the best predictor of mortality, came from the strength of bonding ties. Okay, how about recovery? What impact do social ties have in recovery? I put up here 9 different communities along that coast I mentioned in Japan, hit by the tsunami. Some of them reduced to basically 1/8 of their operating capacity. Infrastructure is down, businesses are down, roads, gas lines, and so forth. And after 2 or 3 years, some of them have bounced back. They're back up 90%, 70%, 50%, but at different rates. Some took a long time to get there, some took less time to get there. And these are some of the images. This is Ishinomaki. This is about a week after the tsunami, and then about a year afterwards. Then we have Tagajo outside Sendai. Again, about a month, 1 year, and 2 years. That white van is still there after 2 years. I suspect insurance fraud, but I'm not quite sure. And I had the chance to talk to people in these communities. And one of the things they pointed out was one community along the coast of more than 100 communities had a massive set of recovery infrastructure. They had this conveyor belt you're looking at right now, which literally ground up mountains nearby and took that debris downtown to raise the downtown about 13 meters. No one else got that, about $2.6 billion US. And that process of creating this process came about because, not of horizontal ties, because of vertical ones. In the communities with stronger ties to legislatures and boosters in the central Tokyo area, we had better recoveries. Where you had more of those boosters, a better recovery, you might even build back better. More roads, more communities, more people are coming in. So interestingly, we're seeing here where horizontal ties mattered a lot initially. Now, as we get to the recovery stage, now we're looking to those vertical ties. One more idea of social capital I want to touch on, which is mental health. And I think we're talking about this more and more, which is really important. We've measured among a number of different disasters, let's call them 3 different types of recovery. The top row is the ideal. You have a shock or a trauma and you bounce back to where you were. The second row is you have a shock or a trauma and you don't quite get back to where you were. And the bottom row, unfortunately, is now becoming more common, what we call PTSD or anxiety, where you have a major shock and it's hard to hold down a job or a relationship, it's hard to function afterwards. So the obvious question is, again, when you have a major shock, like the Fukushima contamination, when the nuclear power plants melted down, what happens to people's mental health? How do we find the factors that help them recover some equilibrium when things seem very, very dire? So initially we thought that 2 factors would be important. We thought that wealth and health would matter. We thought that people with more money would have more access to therapists, they'd be more mobile, they'd be more optimistic. And we thought people with better physical health would be able to run it off or eat tofu, whatever they do. The sad reality is that neither of those hypotheses was supported. No level of income was protective against stress and anxiety from this radioactive experiment. And no good level of physical health mattered. In fact, good physical health had no impact, but bad physical health made it even worse. If you had diabetes, or if you had cancer or something else beforehand, in fact, things got worse. Perhaps some of you can guess the single factor that we found was protective, in fact, was social capital. The best predictor of people having strong mental health recoveries was having a friend or a neighbor who was going through the same thing at the same time and stayed with you for that process for several years afterwards. So I don't have time to talk about COVID tonight, unfortunately. I've got to run to teach after this, so we're going to have to skip this part of the talk. I want very briefly mention that as a segue, we study more than just how social capital matters. We also study how to build these social ties. So I'm going to run through very quickly 6 broad categories of things that we've done. Mr. Rogers says to be a good neighbor. So Australia now has Neighbor Day, which is great. A chance to meet your neighbors. If I asked you on this call, all 75 of you, how many of you know your first and last names of 10 neighbors? You'd all put your hands up because you all know them. But unfortunately, in most people in Melbourne or Sydney or Tokyo or Mexico City, that's only about 1 in 10 people can do that. So the first responders are, in fact, not uniform people, they're neighbors. So the first thing we suggest for cities to think about is neighbor-to-neighbor connections. The next image is Neighbor Fest. San Francisco will give you several $1,000s every year to hold a party, not because they like you, but because they're getting ready for a disaster, a major earthquake. And they know they can't retrofit all the buildings against seismic disasters, but they can build strong social ties by having you organize each other, having a party, stopping traffic, bringing out the bounce house, bringing out the barbecue. The next image is social infrastructure. I'll come back to that in a second. The spaces and places where we connect. The bottom left-hand image is civic engagement. Voting, going to meetings, believing in democracy. The middle one there is what we call faith-based organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, and so forth. And the bottom right is community currency. A way of getting people to volunteer is offering an incentive. We offer them $5 Toronto, let's say, for a half hour of work. That money then only goes to local businesses, mom and pop stores, farmers markets, and so forth. No backers, no big companies. And that process helps bring out volunteers and then circulate that currency locally. I want to shift gears. Josie mentioned the fact I'm working on a new book project, which I indeed am. And that book project asked the question, which seems very obvious, which is, where do these social ties come from? We have very different levels of connections, even in the same city, even in the same neighborhood. So why is it that some communities seem to have more of them and some seem to be lacking? So I want to tell you a story of 2 communities, Tado and Sumohama. These are 2 communities from that area of Japan called Tohoku, which had the major disasters, as I mentioned in 2011. Both of them have, for millennia, faced the exact same shock, which is massive tsunami, huge waves coming in from the ocean about once every 100 years. But Tado and Sumohama had 2 very different ways of handling this. Tado built the Great Wall of Japan. That's what they call it there in the city. It's a 14-meter tall cement barrier around the entire town. It's taller than the second-story buildings in town. It blocks the view of the ocean. But the argument was, as they went bankrupt building it, it will keep us safe. Sumohama, in contrast, did not build any physical infrastructure at all. What they built was social infrastructure. They built a system where everyone in town works together to help each other out during regular disaster drills. The elderly, as you see in this image, are literally put into wheelbarrows and pulled uphill by the young people. Every library, every city hall has a hazard map. Everyone works together to get this stuff done. I want to ask you a question right now to think about as I keep talking here, which is, 1, where would you rather live? Behind the Great Wall of Japan or in Wheelbarrow Town? And also, which of these 2 do you think did better, in terms of mortality at least, when the 2011 tsunami came? Keep those questions in mind. We'll come back to them. Okay, so our lab's been working now for some time to try and understand, where is it that we build social ties? What is it that we can do? So we've categorized every kind of building that we've found, every facility, into 4 categories. The first are parks. Parks include, let's call them Quidditch parks, rugby match areas, places where you play cricket and other games that don't really exist in real life, soccer matches. They're all the kind of spaces, dog walking areas, linear reserves, any place that you can do work outside and play with other people.
That's
parks.
good.
On the right there of parks are community centers. piazzas, city halls, neighborhood houses, places you can enter for free and get together with your group to get together and have conversations. The bottom left-hand corner are places of worship: synagogues, mosques, churches, shrines, temples, and gurdwaras. On the bottom right, that is a social business. What does a social business mean? Social business means a place you've got to pay to get into, a restaurant, a cafe. I know you don't accept Starbucks there so much in Australia, but wherever you get your flat white Americanos, or whatever you call them these days. Why do these four categories matter so much? It matters to us because we've studied the impact of these facilities on bonding, bridging, and linking ties. And here's what we found. These four categories of social infrastructure actively build not bonding or linking ties, but bridging ties. That is to say, the most likely place you'll meet someone who thinks differently than you. In America, it's red and blue. I can't remember the colors you use there in Australia for your different political parties, but the likelihood is I, a blue person, will not meet a red person unless I go to a library, unless I go outside. I'm not going to meet them online because Facebook is curating my stuff, so I see people like me. I'm not going to meet them probably in my house because my family thinks like me, but I might meet them in a park, a linear reserve, a library, or a bar. I might meet them there. And what we're seeing in this image here is all four categories build bridging ties. They don't build bonding ties to people like you or linking ties in vertical. And that really matters a lot because these bridging ties bring us information we wouldn't have normally, ways of thinking about the world we didn't see before, new resources, and access to new networks. So bridging ties are being built in these social infrastructure facilities. And we had a question when we learned this. We said, well, what can we ourselves build from scratch a new social infrastructure facility and then measure what happens? So you're looking at right now Ibasho in Masakicho, Japan. People wearing those vests are spring chickens. You have to be 65 or older to be on the board. And we had a deal. We helped them build this physical house in exchange for taking notes on what happened afterwards. What we found was fascinating. In the next year and a half from construction, the elderly, typically the hardest group to build social ties, had more friends, more sense of belonging, and more efficacy. This brand new place, a shared space for the elderly, was successful in doing all the things that we theoretically thought were possible, which is fantastic. The next question we had was, okay, well, if these places really do build bridging ties, and they are successful sites for connection, what happens to communities during disasters if they have fewer of them? So imagine you live in a new suburb, maybe in Sydney, maybe in Adelaide, which is all high rises, and there's no spaces to connect. There's no parks, there's no pubs, there's no libraries. Or maybe you live in some place where it's just rural areas, and there's no one nearby to where you can connect. So there's kilometers between homes right now, right? And the only places to connect may be in your home or on the Zoom call. So we measured 700 communities with different densities of social infrastructure. And we found the following. Those communities that had more density of these kind of communal spaces, parks, places of worship, social businesses, they actually had lower mortality controlling for about 17 other factors. Meaning, in communities with more of these spaces, you're building those social ties that can save lives during those shocks. Now, what you're thinking right now is, Daniel, that's very nice for Japan, but come on, we're in Australia. This is not really going to work for us. So I've got some data from America. This is from Louisiana. I mentioned I was there during Hurricane Katrina. We've measured here around 20 different counties, they call them parishes in Louisiana, with different levels of disaster hitting from hurricanes. A lot of the purpler areas have more disaster housing that's been happening. And we want to understand what would happen in these communities if local communities invested their money differently. What if they build social infrastructure like we built in Ibasho in Japan? Or what if they didn't build infrastructure? What if they built big gray infrastructure, large-scale development projects? And we measured these in 4 categories. The blue are hard infrastructure. That's gray infrastructure. So bridges, dams, it's large-scale projects. The yellow is state. It means top-down. That means the government came along and told the local community, we already have in place an idea for you. Why don't you take our advice and build this project? The purplish one in the bottom is a local project. That means it was proposed by the community. And the soft one that you see means it was building social infrastructure. So again, what we're trying to measure here is what happens after a disaster when the community has a choice about spending their money, and they spend it in different ways. Bottom up, soft infrastructure to build connections, or top-down large-scale development projects. Now, we also asked these communities in Louisiana, what are the two outcomes that governments care the most about? And they told us it's very easy. We care about people and we care about money. We want to know how much income are people making after the disaster? Are they getting their jobs back? Are they employed? And we want people back in the community. We want people to be coming back. We don't want people going to other communities or moving elsewhere. That exit and voice problem I mentioned earlier. So let's first talk about the blue top line there called hard infrastructure projects. Here's what happened there. If your community invested primarily in hard infrastructure projects, so again, dams, berms, seawalls, bridges, and ports, your income was negative. You actually had less money there afterwards. And your population was also negative. You lost people. So to look at the bottom, those two yellow mountains, these are, by the way, the average treatment effects, ATEs, of these outcomes. If you invested in state-sponsored projects, again, the state comes along, the government tells you, don't worry, we've got your back, we've got some engineers ready to go, you again lost income and you lost people. If, in contrast, the money that you invested after the disaster was a bottom-up idea from the community and was social infrastructure, libraries, parks, linear reserves, and so forth, income was higher and more people came back. So the two outcomes that governments claim they care about were best realized by investing in social infrastructure proposed by the local community. By the way, a really quick story to think about this would be, imagine your community is destroyed by a fire or a flood or whatever's happening, spiders in Australia, something happening there. And the government comes along and says, don't worry, we've got this. For the next 10 years, we're going to be building this massive, whatever it is, concrete bypass, new road, new airport for you. And you're thinking, well, that's very nice, but I want my school back and running. I want my business. I want my kids to have friends again. And for 10 years, what you see is massive construction going on, a lot of things happening, but nothing happening to support your lifestyle. Again, the part that you liked isn't there anymore. The NGO, the church, the synagogue you used to go to is gone, and your friends aren't there. So that's not really going to help you make a choice to come back. If, in contrast, the government immediately invests in rebuilding those social connections, you've got a sense of place, a sense of belonging, that might pull you back a lot quicker. Notice, by the way, New Orleans invested in a lot of big things. I moved out of there as quickly as we could afterwards. Okay, I'm going to skip this because it's the same data. Okay, if you trust me that social capital matters and we build it in social infrastructure, what are the broad challenges now to us as social capitalists? What should we be doing right now? Notice this map that my colleagues and I built of North America. This is actually what we call the Social Capital Index, or SOCI. In fact, you actually can get this, download all this data if you want to yourself. This was a pretty serious project. It took some work. But the funny thing was, we could not build the same kind of map about social infrastructure, those places and spaces where we build ties, because there is no data set, there's no one group holding data on the libraries, the parks, the pubs, and so forth across North America, or Australia, in fact, for that matter. I'll get to that in a second. So both in Australia and in North America, there's a lack of systematic data on access and presence of these social infrastructure facilities. Now, my colleagues and I spent about a year and a half, and we literally wore out dozens of pairs of shoes for our undergraduates who we gave trackers, GPS trackers to, and we sent them out across Boston, which is not a very big city. We had them walk the entire city many times, tracking over 1,200 different facilities that we think qualified as social infrastructure. Notice they're all on this map by neighborhood, but also notice what we discovered in all that work that we did. Incredibly high levels of inequity, of inequality. The communities near the top of the page have 3.6 sites per 1,000 residents. Near the bottom, close to 0. And by the way, if you want to get personal, my community there is Brighton, not the Brighton of London or the Brighton of UK or the Brighton of New York, but Brighton, Massachusetts, where I live. My children growing up had roughly one of these sites per 1,000 residents versus their counterparts in Beacon Hill or the North End, which had 3 to 4 of them per 1,000 people, meaning every time my child wanted to go to the library, we had to go several miles. They had one right nearby. We wanted to go to a social business, like a bowling alley to go play, or a park outside to go play. We had to go much further to find those areas. We had far fewer access to them than children growing up in other communities in Boston. Now, Boston's a progressive, blue, wealthy city. If my city of Boston, which we mapped in this year-and-a-half project, has this level of inequity, I'm sure not in Australia, But maybe in other cities around the world, if we had the money to do this, we would find tremendous levels of inequity as well. Think about where you live. How do you know you actually have good access? Because you've never compared your neighborhood, maybe the neighborhoods nearby in a systematic way. So the second thing is when we did do that work to build our own data set of where things are located, we found huge levels of no access. The third problem that we found overall is we are investing in the wrong things. I mentioned a few slides ago that if your local government builds large-scale, top-down physical infrastructure, roads, ports, and bridges after a disaster, you actually lose people and you lose funds. Well, guess what? 96% of the money being spent in North America, 97% of the money being spent in Japan, and we actually did this for Australia, so now I can tell you, 26 of 29 projects that were funded last year in the DRF money, large-scale physical infrastructure projects, roads, trucks, and so forth, and not bottom-up supporting these kind of processes. We are investing in the wrong thing with regularity across the industrialized democracies. Okay, let's see if I can wrap it up and leave some time for questions. So first, I've tried to argue first that social capital matters, not just lumping it together, but bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Then I've argued that bridging ties, the ones that connect us to people that are different, those are really critical. Those can be built, in fact, at places like libraries, linear reserves, and pubs, and so forth. Too often, though, we're overlooking the power of these kind of facilities to prepare us for disasters. They're not just a library that's going to get its funding cut at the next political rally that we have, or a park will go unused or underused because no one's investing in keeping it back. We are not thinking about these sites as what they really are. These are the resilient underpinnings of our society. Where we have more and better of these facilities, we are better prepared for shocks. Unfortunately, though, at least in North America, when push comes to shove, these are the facilities that get funded last or cut first on the block. With that, I'll say thank you very much and happy to talk.
Fantastic. What an overview. Feel free to put your hand up if you have a question. Nat Stacks.
Hello.
Some observations.
I mean, I love listening to Daniel, and because of the storytelling aspect, but bringing those, I guess, stats and facts to life. And the thing that's in my head for this session and another session that I've listened to is, how do we make that move? How do we get governments to move? How do we get communities to talk about and understand the things that really do matter? And to Daniel's point about the DRF funding for last year and what was actually funded, because Daniel, your research has permeated through a lot of the different projects that a lot of us on here have over many years, and we still can't quite make that change. And yet it's, we see in our communities and we understand exactly what really makes a difference. And there's just, those really beautiful connections. And what is building resilience if you don't have those connections?
Wow, that's first of all, that is good to see you again. That's a great question, as always. And I mean, I guess I would say that, I can't claim that we've moved the needle in some massive way. I am really happy with some small local initiatives that have happened in Boston. So now parts of Boston do a social capital mapping routine every year, which is great. So they actually do measure that. And also there is money in our budget, in fact, in Boston to support these kind of social infrastructure projects, which is also fantastic. But of course, we're one small city of less than 1 million people out of whatever America is, 340 million or whatever at these days, and out of a broader world of 8 billion plus. I think there are several things that I've tried to push on as my levers that try to move things. The one is finding champions, finding individuals who really believe in this idea, who can consistently push this in their organizations, whether it's an NGO or local government, whether it's a council, whether it's as a politician or an academic. The more voices that we have saying the same kind of things, the more I think we're going to move toward real change, where people actually think, right, why are we buying fire trucks and roads? Do people actually, connect in this community? That's one thing. The other thing that I really try to do is to make sure there's data for what I claim. so that I'm not just, going in front of people with my impressions, or, of course, I would love the world to hold hands and all us get along. That'd be great. But I really try to show consistently, and my lab also tries to make the data public so people can test what we say, and to encourage people to get their own data. How do we know what's going on? So many people that I talk to say, of course, I know community is important. Our community is great. I say, fantastic. How do you know? Right? How do you know your community is as well connected as your neighbor's community? What are you doing to connect that? So that we are all citizen scientists in many different ways. We can ask each other questions. We can make that data public. Before every meeting, we can ask how people are doing. There are a lot of things we can do to collect that data. So being consistent, asking that data to be collected, pushing people all the way up. I've been pushing a number of countries to think seriously about how they're keeping this data when we have so many issues going on right now where we're not collecting information. Whether it's in Ukraine right now, for example, talking to people there. I was talking to people actually in Syria, unfortunately during the civil war as well, trying to think about this. How do we know what's going on if we're not recording and capturing? So that, I think that responsibility comes to me. I feel very serious about that I should be taking this data and making it public. And I encourage all of you also to become champions of data. And the final thing I would say would be to use your voice. Too many of my colleagues in academia often only publish in peer-reviewed journals. And I know I see several people on this call right now that do more than that, which is fantastic. But of course, the brass ring or whatever it is often emphasizes publishing in a journal that 4 people read, maybe 5 if my mom is there, right? We don't want that kind of systematic process where we take an important argument and we stick it in a journal that no one cares about, or behind a paywall or whatever else is ridiculous, right? We want op-eds and local community school and school meetings, right? And I would love every school in Australia and America to have a discussion about social ties and cohesion. I would love every school to collect data from students. I've seen some great projects in Boston again, trying to get information about, how are kids connected? Do they feel trust in people? Those are the kind of things that we can do without having lots and lots of budget. So those things I think what I would do, being champions, having data, pushing on all doors. I think a lot of changes are slow, unfortunately. The needle does move slowly, but I do see more and more people when I talk at least saying, yeah, you know what? We have this initiative we're trying out right now, or I remember my friend did this. I'm seeing that a lot more now than I used to.
Thanks, Nat. And an interesting point that Marie makes about, the inbuilt bias in terms of soft versus hard that runs right through in terms of skills and the relationships that you're talking about. So, Ali, you have an interesting observation. Do you want to jump on and make that? And then a question from Julianne.
It was just a reflection on the point that Daniel made about the disaster recovery funding in Australia. And I think Natalie might have referred to it as well. It's actually in the eligibility requirements. Essential public assets are only things like hard infrastructure. So in a disaster recovery setting, when local government is trying to rebuild that community infrastructure, we only get that funding for things like rebuilding roads, drains, culverts, and not the rebuilding of community centres, parks, things like that. So I think that sort of goes into your observation or your insight around that inequity in the prioritisation. Sorry, I'm in a very noisy office, so I've got a bit of background.
Thank you,
I
Ali.
think that's great. And until just a few years ago, FEMA would only repay for building the building back as was. If you tried to upgrade the building, move things to the second floor, raise the building off the ground, make it flood proof or whatever proof, they wouldn't even pay for that. So yes, I sympathize completely. I think a lot of the structures are in place to favor concrete, to favor big things. And of course, there's entire books about disaster capitalism. There are firms that benefit, right, from having to rebuild things every time. And there's, of course, a whole political economy as well, at least in Japan and America, of construction firms who really are very happy that the most funding pours into building new roads and dams and bridges and so forth, and not necessarily into local NGO funding or into local libraries.
Oh, we have that here in Australia too, Daniel. Julianne, and then a comment from Catherine.
Thank you. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I've been following your work for only the past few months, and I found it very, very interesting. However, something I'm wondering about is how this idea of social infrastructure and, needing more social infrastructure in communities that don't have it as much right now, I think is very important. But how does this apply in our society that is already very disconnected and disengaged? As I say in my comment, I feel skeptical that it's a case of just if you build it, they will come. So how do we actually build these sites and actually get people to engage in them who might not otherwise? And I'm thinking especially about, I guess, people who are maybe in their 20s, 30s, 40s who don't have kids necessarily. I remember reading one of the papers about Japan, and you trained up these older people, which I think is a really great idea. But it seemed to me that there were some missing people within the community that would have been engaged or could have been engaged, but they don't necessarily have small kids or an older family member. So just curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a great question. And in fact, I was a consultant to the Surgeon General's in a report on loneliness, the pandemic of loneliness and isolation in North America. And the simple reality is most societies, and you didn't even mention polarization, right, which is an active attempt to split our societies into groups. So the good news, though, is we have a lot of research on this idea. Social infrastructure actually can work against polarization, as I mentioned in the example of red and blue, right? So if you have a dog, you take your dog out walking, you go to the library or a pub. Those are some of the few sites, not online sites, but in real life sites, where you could meet someone from a different political party, a different background, church, mosque, synagogue as well. So those are areas that we have found, if they are built, people actually do come, which it's pretty nifty, actually. Now, of course, by the way, you can't build a random site. For example, I could not go to Japan and build an American carousel or something there. I'd have to build a Chonaikai appropriate facility, or in America's case, I need to build something that Americans would go to. So we want culturally relevant and locally appropriate. But in those cases, our data show people actually do start coming. And especially, by the way, in many new suburbs, when there literally are no facilities built for connections. You have sky rises in many cases, or just suburbs, rows and rows of homes with no space, very common now in some American Midwest communities, when there was why build a library, and if there's no funding for it, or there's no one paying for it. So they didn't build libraries. Parts of Houston are like this. They're deserts for libraries, they're desert for social infrastructure. So yes, we have found, even in societies that are fragmenting or deliberately being fragmented by polarization, these sites have the capacity to bring people together. And of course, as I said, you have to actually have programming there people want to come to. If your library doesn't offer Wi-Fi, forget about the teenagers, right? If your library, like our library now, has lending for tools, it has a after-school program for kids that's free. It has job training as well, ESL classes for our new migrants coming in from other countries. A lot of programming at the library now to bring in people, and it's packed, which is fantastic. And those are the kind of social infrastructure things we want to see. Again, locally relevant, people are going to come into those areas. Of course, if you're running things, I don't know, let's say a tax seminar, you're not going to get the kids to come in. If there's no Wi-Fi, you're not going to get, so you have to build these facilities with that in mind. In the same way that I wouldn't know where to start for talking about, for example, the First Nations peoples in Australia. I've got no idea how I would build a social infrastructure that'd be appropriate to them. Would it be outdoors, indoors? I don't know anything about that. I wouldn't start. So for me, that's a good example. I would not know how to help someone who says to me, okay, Daniel, let's go out to a community of First Nations peoples. What do we do? I wouldn't know. But again, we have to ask them. The same thing we said before, that bottom-up process, social infrastructure that's appropriate. I think we do see good results of this. You build it and they will come.
Fantastic. Really interesting question from Catherine Ellis. Thank you, Catherine. And then a question from Rose.
Thanks, Josie. So the leadership programs we run have a huge element of connecting leaders from different sectors, different backgrounds, different identities. And I instinctively feel that actually that can play a real role in particularly bridging social capital and linking social capital. So Dane, I'm curious to know if you've looked at the role that leadership plays in all of this work as well.
It's a great question. We have not done because it's really, really hard for us to define what a leader is, or how they're built, or what qualities they have. There are definitely a lot of work, though, on the idea of programming that's contact-based, meaning you deliberately bring groups together from different backgrounds. That there is very good evidence to show what we call the contact hypothesis, meaning if I'm a white guy from North America, I've never met a First Nations persons before, I may hold certain stereotypes. Bringing me together with someone from that community is the best way to get me beyond that moment. And that's exactly what a lot of communities are deliberately doing through all kinds of ways. Again, this bridging social capital approach. So I can't talk about leadership, but I can absolutely affirm if you're deliberately bringing leaders together from different backgrounds, that's a great way to build these bridging ties.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Rose.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's just been really enlightening and encouraging. I work in the disaster recovery team of Sunshine Coast Hospital Health Service. So we have funding to work with community, and I'm on this Zoom because of doing the Resilience Canopy practitioner training, which has just been absolutely invaluable in terms of understanding that first step of community engagement, of listening to what people are worried about, and then doing some work around how to support exactly what you're talking about, that social capital. So I feel encouraged from coming to this talk, knowing that we are on the right trajectory in terms of what we're doing. So much of it is about connecting people and asking communities, and every community is a little bit different. I think I take away mostly that bridging part where people are going to be connecting with people they would not normally meet or have the ability. But I suppose my question is, could you direct me towards some papers or something in terms of like being able to collect that data? I was talking to our team leader only this week that the way our network has been happening with us as an involved, team around communities, it can really start after 6 months of working across 3 LGAs that, that 6 degrees of separation of like this person, and then we find that those people know those people in community. And I really would like to map that so that I can bring that to communities, so that, and particularly, I suppose, practitioners that are working, and I'm in mental health. So, social workers and OTs and teachers, just so to encourage people that, the things that we're doing are actually working. Making those relationships does work. So is there something you could direct me to start me off in terms of like getting some actual models that I can work with?
Yes, if you just email me, we actually have about 16 single-space pages of questions that we use in our surveys across the world, obviously translated in different languages, but this is all in English, so just email me. It's just daniel.aldrich@gmail.com, so my name at Gmail, and happy to send you that stuff that we have. And also I can share papers with you as well on how we're capturing social infrastructure. What is it that we're looking at when we send our students out with their worn-out shoes to go map those areas?
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Scott, you have a question. Scott Walker.
Hi, thank you, Daniel, for really crystallizing that presentation. Was amazing for me. So I just wondered, the Japanese examples that you gave are pretty powerful. Has there been anything post the 22 floods or even bushfires from the Australian perspective that we could also use that you might know of?
Yeah, I know that there's a scholar, I think her name is Renee Zanow, Zahnow. I believe she's in Brisbane. She's been doing some really great work on social infrastructure and social cohesion. Really good work. And actually, Josie can email me, or I can email her. So yes, there are several Australian scholars. Also, there's really good work in Melbourne that was being done before as well by a team there. There is still, not to my knowledge at least, let's call it a full state or cross state set of data collection on this question, whether it's on social capital or social infrastructure. And I know that there are several DRF proposals in this year to try and push both individual states, but also the national government to take seriously the idea that we really want to be able to talk about, state X and state Y investing in programs or making progress or not in a comparative way, rather than just sort of guesstimating where things are. So in terms of papers, yes, there are several papers. In terms of a framework for the collection of data, not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, Daniel, but I've got a question, and it sort of goes back to what Nat raised at the start about the balance of storytelling and evidence and data collection and kind of getting that calibration right. But with the advent of AI and those kinds of tools, are you sort of factoring that in terms of your own work? And, what's the potential there is one question. And then to finish off with maybe a little bit of a teaser about your book that's coming out next year. Stand by.
Let's hope, yes, if the glacial pace of academic publishing grinds forward. So AI, I think, does have great potential, especially in the fields what we call humanics, where we as human beings are trying to train machines to think like we do, and maybe discover patterns that we couldn't have seen otherwise. So actually, I'm on a project right now that's taking around 3,000 survivors' stories from multiple shocks across multiple societies and trying to find similar patterns in how they tell their stories. So, for example, the Rwandan massacre, the Hiroshima bombing, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Hurricane Katrina, the massacre at Srebrenica and other places. So this is one way we could not do this by hand. It's just too much information. Like literally after reading 2 of them, you're so depressed you don't want to go on. But the computer, with your help, can go through and help code. In this case, it's something like tens of thousands of pages of testimonies for what happened to these shocks and disasters, and try to find patterns. So I think there is tremendous possibility there. Of course, we want to make sure that we know what's going on, that we're clear how the algorithm is working. I think that's important as well. As for my next book, actually, the next book is very much on what we've been talking about at the end here on social infrastructure, and this idea that it can work during disasters. In fact, it's one part of the book. The other 2 parts of the book focus on 2 other types of disasters that we face. One is terrorism, and the other is crime. And what I've been trying to do is find not just narratives that we've been talking about, but also data, hard data, that can show communities with, again, more of these 4 types of social infrastructure, they have better outcomes from crime, from terrorism, and from what I'm calling extreme weather events. And the good news, at least for those of us like me trying to publish the book, is there's pretty consistent evidence across time and space. I've got evidence from Africa, evidence from Europe, evidence from Japan and North America. And I try to show, using different examples from different societies, that in fact, this is a very powerful, underutilized tool. We often jump to the most sophisticated technology that we can find, whether it's AI, for example, or building a new tool or building a new app. And in fact, some of the ways that we can solve problems are very old, which again is cooperation, cohesion, coordination. And what we're finding in this book, at least I'm finding, is across these different societies and states over time and place, these kind of facilities really have brought people together, not just to solve the problem of shocks and disasters, but also to reduce crime and also to help manage terrorism, which for me has been a really eye-opening and very warm feeling I've gotten. So that's what I hope will be coming out sometime soon. It's called Beyond Common Ground, right? These spaces are common ground for us in our societies, again, places that we can meet, but they can do more than that. It can go beyond them because they'll have impact in other areas as well.
Daniel, thank you so much. That's a great note to wrap up this call on. You know, there is so much that's possible, and you've been at the forefront of actually gathering the evidence to demonstrate what is possible when we work together in different ways, and the invaluable contribution that you have made, not just in the resilience arena, but more broadly, all of these associated policy areas. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. Look forward to hearing more about the book. And, you know, please join me in thanking Daniel. And I know he's got to race off to teach, but hope it goes well, Daniel. Keep in touch.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you,
Thanks, everybody.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.